Chelsea Manning walks out of prison a free woman. She blew the whistle on U.S. atrocities during the Iraq War. But did it have an impact, or did she go to jail in vain? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Chelsea Manning. Seven years ago, Chelsea Manning entered a military prison a soldier. She now walks out a symbol for free speech, government transparency, and transgendered rights. But while her personal story is one of triumph over adversity, what effect did she have on the Iraq War? Manning was convicted in 2013 for giving hundreds of thousands of classified documents to the website WikiLeaks. She said US and Iraqi soldiers were committing war crimes and the public had a right to know. Government officials played down the impact of her actions on Iraq. While at her sentencing hearing, a US official testified her actions had a chilling effect on US foreign policy. So which is it? We'll debate that in a moment with our panel, but first, Sandra Gatman begins the conversation with this report.
It was the largest classified military leak in history. Nearly 400,000 field reports painting a daily picture of the Iraq War between 2004 and 2009 revealed to the world.
You're clear. All right, firing.
Videos like this of U.S. soldiers shooting Iraqi civilians from a helicopter.
Come on, fire.
The Iraq war logs suggested the number of civilians killed was higher than reported, and that the U.S. military turned a blind eye to torture and abuse by American and Iraqi forces. The damning evidence was exposed by Private Chelsea Manning, who handed the documents and cables to the whistleblowing website WikiLeaks. She was convicted under the Espionage Act and handed a 35-year sentence, later commuted by President Barack Obama.
Given she went to trial, due process was carried out, the sentence that she received was very disproportionate relative to what other leakers had received. It made sense to commute and not pardon her sentence.
7 years on, Chelsea Manning now walks free, a hero to those who wanted injustice brought to light. But the fighting in Iraq continues. So has the bloodshed. Iraqi forces are engaged with a new enemy, Daesh. Over the last year, a military campaign has steadily pushed its fighters out of cities like Ramadi, Fallujah, and Mosul. But rights groups say that with every battle, the tactics of old have resurfaced, where government forces and Shia paramilitary groups carry out revenge attacks on Sunni Arabs suspected of supporting Daesh.
I continually get reports of bodies cropping up. These are bodies that are found on the sides of roads, in the middle of places like East Mosul, in neighborhoods. Bodies that are men, their eyes are bound, their hands are bound behind their back, and nobody knows who put them there, how they got there, but they were very clearly in detention at the time that they were killed.
As part of the coalition fighting Daesh in Iraq and Syria, the U.S. has limited its role to training troops and launching airstrikes. Transparency activists have even welcomed the coalition's daily reports on its bombing campaign. Yet the monitoring project Air Wars believes civilian deaths are being underreported by as much as 90%. It finds that in the last 2 years, the coalition has conducted 14,200 airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, with officials claiming only 152 civilian deaths. Air Wars thinks as many as 1,500 non-combatants died in that period. There's concern, too, that international players have been able to hide behind the front of a broad coalition.
We have seen that very little information is coming out when it comes to, for example, training of Iraqi forces, which forces, for example, the Americans are prohibited from training because there have been documented abuses, which they are using into other countries in order to support. Things like that, there's very little transparency.
And there's less photographic evidence of the abuses taking place as the perpetrators adapt to a new era of potential leaks. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by Aki Peretz. He's a former CIA counterterrorism analyst. From Baghdad, Ahmed Rushdie, the director of the House of Iraqi Expertise Foundation. And in San Diego, Iraqi-American author Ibrahim al-Marashi. He's in the history department at California State University. Thanks all of you for joining us. Aki, if I may begin with you, Chelsea Manning, heroic whistleblower or traitor?
Well, it's always it's difficult to say whether one person is one or another. But I think it's important for folks to understand that where Chelsea Manning began leaking and providing all this information, the United States was actually well on its way out of Iraq. Remember that he started his leaks in late 2009, early 2010. By that time, Barack Obama, who ran specifically as an anti-war candidate, was already in the White House. We already had the status of forces agreement with the Iraqi government saying that we will pull out of, we'll withdraw all combat forces from Iraq by the end of 2011. And actually, even before Chelsea Manning had done a single thing, we had already pulled out U.S. troops from all Iraqi cities. And so we'd already pulled out and brought out a lot of information, a lot of material, equipment, people out of Iraq by 2010 or so. So Chelsea Manning
just for a second, just a second. So did the government then overreact, whether it was the White House, the DOD, or the State Department? Did they just all overreact to this because WikiLeaks had no impact on the Iraq war?
I think WikiLeaks had an accelerating impact on how people felt about the status of the Iraq war, at least here in the United States. But remember, by 2006, people in the United States, the public, if you look at polling, had decisively turned against the Iraq war. In 2006, if you look at the elections, the Democrats actually took Congress from the Republicans, specifically over anti-war issues, and it affected lots of Republicans across the country. So, for example, in my home state of Maryland, the governor lost because he was a Republican, not because of any real reason that he was anti or pro-Iraq war.
Okay, interesting point. So the leaks by Manning accelerated a process that was already happening. That's according to Aki Peretz. Ahmed Rushdie, you were in Iraq at the time. Tell me, what was the response on the ground in Iraq amongst Iraqis when those leaks came out?
Well, actually, the impact was very bad against the American forces, and the people get furious here and become to say, okay, we want you to get out of our country, which is actually supported the slogan of Mr. Maliki at that time, and also President Obama. But at the end, if it is wrong or right, the withdrawal of Iraq, because at the end we had Daesh. Right. And Daesh is actually presented in Iraq because of the emptiness of the real security forces that presented in the Iraqi soil. That means that what's happened at that time in 2010 actually was used by even the American administration at that time and the Iraqi administration at that time to push the withdrawal of the American forces outside Iraq, but at the same time, they didn't manage to have a plan to secure the Iraqi soil and ended with Daesh. So I think we must, and now the Iraqis seeing themselves were framed in 2010.
So do you think they regret being...
They're asking the same question, why the American forces withdraw?
Okay, interesting. So do you think those who responded so angrily to say, get out of our country, especially when those leaks came out, when we saw the collateral murder video of the helicopter gunship shooting dead those people. So do you think the Iraqis regret being so angry at the Americans? Do you think that they wish the Americans were still in the country?
Well, instead of that, the Iraqis now wandering around. If the responsible men at that time should be accused of betraying their own country, because at the end they didn't have the right plan. I mean, the Prime Minister and his followers, the ministers at that time, they didn't have a plan, a real plan on the Iraqi soil to secure all of Iraq. So why you did push the American forces outside, and at the end you didn't fight Daesh, you didn't even get any resistance against Daesh, and Daesh took Mosul and Anbar and so many.
But undoubtedly, I mean, Daesh came up in 2012, and these things, you know, they're all interconnected, understandably. but there was a domino effect, right? Daesh wasn't around in 2006, 2007. Be that as it may, let me move to Ibrahim al-Marashi. Ibrahim al-Marashi, again, at the heart of all of this, what Chelsea Manning did and the global ramifications it had and the impact on Iraq, was it for the better or did it cause more harm than good, Ibrahim?
I wouldn't say it caused any harm in that basically Chelsea Manning, she released documents that documented what the United States did in Iraq, but the U.S. was on its way out of Iraq at that time. So I can't see any harm. It wasn't like Afghanistan where it was feared that the documents she released with Afghanistan, the Taliban would go look at them, see who was collaborating with the U.S. and hunt them down. By that time, the U.S. was more or less out of there. It just revealed basically the biggest harm, I would say, long-term was the State Department cables that Chelsea Manning had and uploaded. There it kind of revealed geopolitical sensibilities that usually the State Department liked to be kept quiet.
Right. I mean, and one of the jokes at the time was, oh my God, WikiLeaks showing that diplomats lie? Who'd have thought that? Now, Manning is a divisive person, divisive within the United States, lots of opinion, especially on social media. There was an interesting tweet at the time of the commuting of the sentence. Obama commutes sentence of Chelsea Manning. How many people died because of Manning's leak? That was from Judith Miller, the writer, the journalist. She wrote that in the New York Times. Controversial tweet, and it provoked a firestorm of a response. Aki Peretz, did Judith Miller have a right to try to blame Manning for deaths in Iraq?
Well, one of the things I think is important to say, if Judith Miller says that a lot of people died, well, then the question is who died and under what circumstances? We hear about Chelsea Manning's efforts in Iraq, but really what your previous guest talked about was all these State Department cables that came out, whether it's Afghanistan and elsewhere. How many people were directly affected by these efforts? Chelsea Manning basically gave up things at the secret level in the government classification system. A secret is considered serious damage, but it's not top secret, which is considered grave damage to the United States government. And you actually saw, if you actually parsed through a lot of the State Department cables, you will saw U.S. diplomats basically doing exactly what you think they're doing. They're criticizing individuals and countries for doing bad things. They're meeting with human rights people. They're meeting with other ambassadors. They're going about the usual humdrum nature of what world diplomacy is. And if you sort of look at what Judith Miller says and said people died because of Chelsea Manning, I would say, who?
Aki, did people die because of Judith Miller when she wrote about WMDs that didn't exist?
That is a great question. I would suggest that absent Judith Miller, we probably still would have gone to war with in Iraq, and we would have invaded Iraq because the folks in the White House really wanted a conflict in the Middle East in 2002, 2003.
Ibrahim, did people die because of Chelsea Manning?
No, I can't find any cause and effect because of Chelsea Manning downloading a lot of documents and then uploading them onto WikiLeaks, that there's a correlation between information being released and people being killed. No.
Ahmed, when you saw that the sentence was commuted 28 years early by President Barack Obama, and he also said, you heard it in the report just preceding the discussion, that they felt this was too much. While it was a fair ruling, it was just too much. Was that an admission from the US president at the time that Chelsea Manning provided a valuable service to the United States?
Or it's just like a hidden things that have been done, is that you put them life sentence, at the same time you're going to use what Manning did in a way that pushing the American forces outside Iraq. Now, this is politics, of course, but how much Iraq get damaged from this political movement? At the end, I have people killed in Mosul, so many people killed in Mosul, in Anbar, and Diyala, and Salah ad-Din, and even Daesh came to Abu Ghraib in the west of Baghdad. They reached Baghdad. all these huge damages shouldn't consider for what's happened in 2010. I think it should be considered. It should be reviewed. At the end, is the decision at that time was right or wrong? And what are the impacts that happen after that decision should be also be viewed by the Americans and by the Iraqis and even by the international community, just to get a lesson, is that the correct decision should be for the benefit of win-win theory. It cannot be only for one person, or let's say one party, to win in the elections, to have something that it will damage the whole country and even the whole reputation of the American forces at that time.
And do you want American forces back in your country now that Daesh are in the country? You have Shia militias roaming the country, trying to fight Daesh, claiming to fight Daesh, but also hurting many civilians who happen to be of the other sect. The central government has little control of the country. Do you want Americans back in your country?
I want the international community to get their own responsibility of what's happening in Iraq, because terrorism already, well, blessed everywhere, even in the United States, in France, in London, in everywhere. At the end, if the international community get their own responsibility, that means it's not only the military actions will happen in the Iraq soil, but also to rehabilitate the Sunni community and have a healthy community that has three main tasks: fighting terrorism as a Sunni community, secondly, sit down with the partner on the national wise, and thirdly, have a good regional and international relations, which reaching a healthy state of the community, of the Sunni community, that at the end there will be the real damage for Daesh and another, for the Daesh and for the militia, because the fight until now in Iraq didn't manage to have the final solution, which must the international community has its own responsibility on it.
Okay, and Aki, is there any appetite in Washington to be a part of a plan like that?
Well, it's actually quite interesting that your guest talks about the international community doing a lot of the fighting and a lot of the dying. When people talk about the international community, it really means the United States, because who else is the international community? The Europeans don't have a military who's willing, and they certainly don't have the political will to go in and fight a ground war in Iraq. Who else is there? The Russians, the Chinese.
Good point.
The only other international partner is Iran, which obviously the United States does not get along with.
Okay, so Ahmed, are you basically calling for American troops back in your country, but you're trying to say it in a more palatable way so it doesn't sound so unpopular? So you're saying international community. You want American forces, don't you? They make up the bulk of the troops.
I don't need, let's learn from the lesson. It's not only the military forces. It must be collaborated with other sectors. We are talking about rebuilding of the whole society. That means I need it on the military level, on the political level, on the economical level, and also for the social level. At the end, Iraq has so many crises. It's not only the military, it's not only security. We have corruption, we have economical crisis, we have social crisis. We need to stabilize things. We need to make a real formation of national reconciliation. That's why that's why I said the international community, because it's not only military. We need all these efforts to combine together to have a real solution on Iraq, because at the end, if Iraq didn't get from its crisis, that means everyone will have, it will spread in the global way.
Okay, understood clearly. Now, I want to shift focus very slightly. We're getting quite granular into Iraq. I want to talk a little bit about WikiLeaks itself, because I find it fascinating, Ibrahim, that a lot of the focus went away from Chelsea Manning, the initial leaker. It went on to WikiLeaks. While Manning was in jail, WikiLeaks developed its own personality, became its own thing. How did it change perceptions of Manning, perceptions of the Iraq War, that WikiLeaks went on and became something else and became quite unpalatable for many other people when you had Assange and his multiple scandals, his opinions on different wars and so on? How did that evolution or devolution change things, Ibrahim?
So, as of Chelsea's revelation, I think WikiLeaks was like the Abu Ghraib scandal. It gave a graphic image that we could associate with the American presence in Iraq. By the time with the Snowden documents, you see it becomes a geopolitical pawn, in that it could release documents, but documents now that, let's say, Russia and China would covet or see some kind of advantage in having documents being released. And then you see it having kind of a two-sided, being like a double-edged sword, let's say, in the American elections, so that you could have Trump calling Manning an ungrateful traitor for releasing these documents onto WikiLeaks. At the same time, he was more than happy to have these documents be a repository of the hacked correspondence of the Democratic National Convention. So we see it's evolved. It's become kind of something that's coveted. It's become a player in geopolitics, not only on the geopolitical level, but then affects also domestic American politics.
Yeah, and this is fascinating. So, Aki, you have this, you have this soldier. She's 5'3" tall, very sort of low-key, very shy personality, and so on. This was the initial source. And then you have WikiLeaks, on the other hand, who's this global player, as Ibrahim mentions it. Is it as big as Ibrahim mentions it to be? Is it a major player on the world scene, Aki?
It is. WikiLeaks is a major player on the world scenes because the Russians has supersized and made it extremely powerful. It's basically used as a propaganda effort for the Russians, and the Russians have other avenues for discussion, including DC leaks, the supposed Guccifer 2.0, to push out and hurt other countries. These include, it's funny, after the election, and I'm sure people can talk about the elections here and how WikiLeaks tried to influence it, but as soon as that was over, then it tried to influence the Germans' elections, and then we saw it in the French elections. We saw a lot of information being pushed out, let's say, on Turkey, because it was supposedly in Russia's best interest to do so. And so the organization has really morphed into a voice for Russian strategic interests. And Julian Assange is the kind of individual who has, for better or for worse, has become a patsy for Moscow. Okay, that's an interesting opinion. It's a strong opinion, and WikiLeaks would defend themselves vehemently against that, which gives me the idea, Aki, I want to invite you back on the show so you can hopefully debate WikiLeaks. Sure. That'll be really good. But yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. All these years on, if it wasn't for Manning, we wouldn't have had WikiLeaks. We wouldn't have had Snowden. We wouldn't have had the NSA leaks. It's been an extraordinary decade or so. Chelsea Manning is free. Debate rages on about WikiLeaks and the Iraq war as well. Gentlemen, unfortunately, I've got to wrap this now because I have to move on. Aki Peretz, Ahmed Rushdie, and Ibrahim Al-Marashi, it's been good to talk to all of you. Coming up on the program, cholera spreads through Yemen. We report on the latest challenge the war-torn country is facing and why you might not know about it. Also,
since the Bronze Age, this area, known as the Citadel, has towered over what is now Jordan's capital. Wedged between conflict zones in the West Bank and Israel, as well as Syria and Iraq, Jordan plays a pivotal role in maintaining stability. But the pressure from these conflicts, as well as Jordan's own economic, political and security issues, are casting a shadow over Amman. Is the kingdom about to reach a turning point or breaking point?
We're looking at Jordan all this week, and our topic today is the country's refugees. More than 1 million live on the border and in the capital, Amman. That's one of the biggest populations in the region. And while it's taking an economic toll on the country, safety is increasingly becoming a problem. 2 car bombs on Monday killed at least 6 people and wounded several others in a Syrian refugee camp just across the border. Daesh took responsibility, just as it did with a number of similar attacks this year. So, can the Jordanian government protect some of the world's most vulnerable people? And where do they go from here? Yvette McCullough went to Jordan to find out, and she sent us this report from the Zaatari refugee camp.
For nearly 80,000 refugees, this makeshift city is home. A temporary fix for an overwhelming need. as war forced them to abandon their homes, possessions, jobs, and dreams. While it's hoped life here in the Zaatari camp is still only temporary, as the wars dragged on, refugees have tried to make a new life for themselves. Many people here haven't been able to work and rely on UN assistance of less than $30 a month. Some make a little extra through the camp's informal economy. Here the market sells everything from furniture to teapots to headscarves. And programs have also been set up that offer work inside the camp.
To me, it is very important to ensure that people go back to that normalcy of a human being, of being able to earn and to spend. Assistance is not really the normal way of living.
Anissa Gassam Fidel worked as a private tutor before fleeing Syria 5 years ago. Now she's a teacher as part of the camp's Cash for Work scheme.
When we first came here, I encountered a lot of difficulties. I came with my son alone and my husband came after 2 months. After that, we came here and we established ourselves step by step.
Anissa says passing knowledge on to the next generation is an important, fulfilling job.
When I found work and started working, I was very happy and I felt like I made things easier at home and removed a big burden, especially from my husband.
Adel Tukan is also part of the Cash for Work scheme. Today he's working as my guide. He says before this he had nothing to do with his time and the boredom made him feel very low.
Thank God our household income is improved. Thank God the program is very good. It increases job opportunities for people after us. Every 6 months, new people are employed in the camp.
Last year, the government said it would create 200,000 jobs and made it easier for refugees and employers to apply for work permits. It also allowed for refugees living in camps to get them too. But so far, refugees have been slow to apply for them.
Around 40,000 refugees now have permits to work in Jordan, but many thousands remain working in the shadows. With Jordan's sluggish economy and high unemployment, decent paying jobs are limited. And officially, Syrians are only allowed to work in jobs open to foreigners. Abu Basil from Homs came to Jordan in 2013. In Syria, he was a photographer and owned his own shop. He says he took photos of his children every single day, but when he was forced to flee, he left everything behind. He says when he arrived in Jordan, UN assistance wasn't enough to get by.
So we worked, even if it was illegal, because we had no choice. I used to do one thing, but now I've tried many different jobs. I sold vegetables, I worked in the mall, I made water jugs.
Abu now works legally in a factory.
Before we got work permits, we were working under heavy stress. And after we got work permits, it was much simpler. We felt better about our work.
Abu says he would love to open his own photography business again, but says his dream now is just to make sure his 2 boys have a good life and education. It's a simple hope shared by many refugees living in Jordan. But as the strain of their host's economy deepens, and their lives become more entrenched, that hope may be harder to hold on to. Yvette McCullough in Amman for the Newsmakers.
Let's talk more with our panel. Joining me now is Lewis Turner, who's a researcher at the University of London and recently spent a year in Jordan studying the Syria refugee response. Also on the program is the UNHCR's Marwa Hashim. She's in Amman, but also works out of the Zaatari refugee camp. Both of you, thank you very much for joining us. Marwa, if I can begin with you, how bad is the situation for Syrian refugees in Jordan?
There are around 650 registered with UNHCR Syrian refugees. The situation is, as they were going into the 7th year, the situation becomes, of course, protracted, and their economic situations becomes worse. However, with the opening of the work permits, as you've kindly mentioned in your report, and thanks to the Jordanian government, we are hoping that they will have more sustainable income and their situation would improve.
Okay, so that's a hope. Lewis, they can do some work now with these work permits. There is some formal labor for these Syrian refugees. Should we be giving credit where it's due and thanking and crediting the Jordanian government?
I think it's absolutely a positive step forward that Syrians can access some forms of employment, and certainly that gives them security, particularly in terms of the risk of being arrested for working without a permit or deported back to Syria. But I think we also have to make sure that the focus is not just on whether Syrians can access jobs, but whether they can access decent jobs that pay wages that can allow people to live in Jordan decently and that have proper working conditions that aren't exploitative.
So, Marwa, can they access decent jobs rather than just jobs as a whole?
There are certain sectors which are open, or areas that are open currently for the Syrian refugees, mainly in agriculture, construction, and wholesale trade and food processing. Of course, we are advocating for more areas to be open, but the mere fact that this has been opened is a positive step.
Lewis, tell me a bit more about those who have been deported, those who have been sent back. I mean, I remember reading stories about people who were sent back to places like Daraa and other places in Syria, which are, you know, horrendous. There are no places to go back home to, right? Those who were deported, did they have due process from the Jordanian government? Was there a fair process before they were sent back?
No, largely not. People have been deported for several different categories of reasons, one of which is alleged security concerns, but the reports all say that there has been no due process or tribunal to determine whether those accusations are accurate. People have also been deported essentially as a punishment for working without a permit, and again that tends to happen very quickly without any appeal or due process. There have also been many instances where people have been sent from living in Jordan's towns and cities to refugee camps like Azraq, in which the conditions are particularly bad, again as a punishment for working without a permit.
Marwa, is that true? Is that what's happening from your perspective, that there is this sort of punishment towards the refugees from the Jordanian government?
But that's an interesting point, but then what would we, the Jordanian government has to secure its land, and we are advocating for all the cases in Jordan and for all the refugees to have a decent and safe life and dignity.
Okay, so Lewis, are you satisfied by that? Because the Jordanian government is worried about Daesh infiltration, for example, just across the border. As we mentioned, those car bombs went off, 6 people died in Rukban camp across the border. So firstly, do you acknowledge that they have valid security concerns? And as Marwa suggests, they have to secure their country, which means that some people have to be deported. Are you satisfied by that, Lewis?
I mean, I would certainly accept that there are some valid security concerns in maybe a small number of cases, but even in those cases, Syrian refugees are absolutely entitled to some sort of due process and tribunal to establish whether those security concerns are valid. What we hear from human rights groups and from aid agencies is that that is not what is taking place, but that people can be deported on the basis of rumours, on the basis essentially as punishments for their behaviour or political beliefs. So what's happening, it seems, is not correct due process to establish Jordan's security, which of course is important, but something quite different.
Okay, so Marwa, is there due process, whether it's from the Jordanian government, from UNHCR, from all the factors, all the different players involved there in the camps, are these people going through a fair process?
UNHCR advocates, as I said before, UNHCR advocates for the rights of refugees and for the protection of refugees from any problems. And we are advocating with the government of Jordan for due process.
Do you believe, Marwa, that the Jordanian government is being fair or that they can do better?
The Jordanian government is bearing a lot of burden in general, and we have been working very successfully with the Jordanian government, and hosting a very big number of refugees is a big burden that a lot of countries should be sharing the burden of. And if we go back to the idea of the work permits and opening that for the refugees, it's a huge step.
Absolutely. So, granted, 1.3 million Syrian refugees in Jordan, 20% of the population. This is massive, right? It costs $2.5 billion per year. All granted. And the work permit news is good news, Marwa. But my question was, is the government being fair, and can it do better? Because we're seeing these situations where some people are not getting an opportunity to explain themselves, to say, hey, maybe I'm not who you think I am, don't send me away. So can they do better, Marwa?
Actually, as I said, we are working with the government to advocate for the protection of refugees.
Lewis, are you satisfied by that?
Well, I think that UNHCR is in a difficult position here. Obviously, it has to have a close working relationship with the Jordanian government. But I think, if I may, to answer your question directly, absolutely the Jordanian government can be doing better. It has to be praised and given credit where it implements good policies for refugees, where it affords protection and opportunities to work. But I think it's also important humanitarian agencies and the international community at large speak out when Jordan doesn't live up to standards or doesn't treat refugees living in Jordan with the rights and dignity that they deserve.
Let me ask you, Lewis, about what Mohammed Mo'man, the Minister of State for Media Affairs, said recently to the Jordanian press. He said, we stand on high moral ground when it comes to aiding refugees, and we hope the international community helps us shoulder this international responsibility. So I asked you if the Jordanians can do more. Lewis, can the international community do more, or are they throwing Jordan under the bus here and just making them carry the workload here?
Absolutely, the international community could be doing more and should be doing more. And in some ways, what Jordan is doing is remarkable in terms of the numbers of Syrian refugees, among refugees also of other nationalities that it hosts. And the international community and donor states in the EU and North America, their commitment to funding what's happening in Jordan and the response that's needed has been very poor, and their own offers of resettlement have also often been very poor. So, yeah, I appreciate totally that Jordan is in many ways doing more than most states are doing for Syrian refugees, but that, of course, doesn't mean that it couldn't be doing better, and that in some particular instances, like in cases of deportation, it has to be doing a lot better in order to protect what are really basic and vital human rights for Syrians.
Marwa Hashim, tell me, what is the difference between the very formal camps like Zaatari, it's massive, it's like a city in itself, and those informal ones that are on the border, and some of them also peppered along the Syrian border, where there doesn't seem to be much protection for the people. Tell me the difference between those.
For the camps in Jordan are managed and by the SRAD, which is the Syrian Refugee Authority, and is under the protection of the Jordanian government, and humanitarian agencies can work in the government in the camps along with the in the camps along with the government. The other camps are informal, as you've said, and they are not inside the country.
Okay, and that poses a whole host of problems. Is there a way, Marwa, to maybe get the international community, even though despite the risks, to get them to take control of those camps just across the border?
This is not on Jordanian land, I believe.
Okay. Lewis, let me ask you a final question. Jordan, like Lebanon and other countries in the region, have had refugees in refugee camps for generations. Ask the Palestinians, right? They are people who have been the children of refugees, the grandchildren of refugees. What's to guarantee that this won't happen to the Syrians, and that 50 years from now we won't be talking about Zaatari refugee camp for Syrians?
I think there's no guarantee of that. I think it's perfectly possible, although obviously we would hope that Syrians will be able to return to their country safely and soon. It's absolutely possible that many Syrians will end up living in Jordan for the long term, and that there may still be Syrians living in Jordan in places like Zaatari in years, decades and generations to come, although obviously we hope that people will have the option to go home safely.
Okay, it's been good to talk to both of you, Lewis Turner and Marwa Hashim. And Marwa, I understand the difficulties and I understand the challenges threading the needle between your humanitarian work and the political realities. It's been great to have you on the program. Thanks so much.
Between the 27th of April and the 13th of May, we have had more than 8,500 suspected cholera cases in 14 different governorates, and unfortunately already 115 people died.
A deadly waterborne disease is spreading rapidly in Yemen, a country which is also a war zone. And just like war, children are the most vulnerable.
الأطفال يتوافدون المصابين ببكتيريا الكوليرا. الأسرة لم تكفي حتى الآن. الكادر الفني أيضا ناقص، لا يكفي لأن يقوم بتلك المهمة العاتقة عليهم.
The United Nations now estimates that a child under the age of 5 dies every 10 minutes from preventable causes in Yemen. Cholera isn't the only threat, but the speed at which it spreads makes it especially deadly. Severe cases can kill within hours unless treated with intravenous fluids and antibiotics.
We know all the fact that there is 2 years of war in Yemen. There is a huge impact on the infrastructure. The electricity power is on and off. The water pumping stations are not functioning regularly. And this has an impact on the quality of water.
People in Sana'a have called for more international help, while blaming Western leaders for supporting those causing much of the violence. Saudi Arabia has undertaken a relentless bombing campaign against Iran-backed Houthi rebels. While both sides are accused of war crimes, the Saudi-led coalition's arms blockade is seen as part of the problem in getting aid to the 4 and 5 Yemenis who need it.
The one who have kidnapped the country and has sent the country into chaos, the Saudi-led coalition, because when Houthi seized the government in 21st of September 2014, this was 6 months before the war. There was no starvation. On the blockade, the Saudi to ban weapons to come into Yemen, but the Saudi has used this blockade to stop food and medicine coming into Yemen.
Now, the Saudi-led coalition has set its sights on the port of Hodeidah, a crucial lifeline that supplies relief to much of the country.
UNICEF and WHO, along with existing health and WASH partners, are trying their best possible to respond to the crisis. But the scale is on an increasing trend, and certainly this time the outbreak is much more aggressive than the last wave, which was witnessed in October 2016.
The conflict in Yemen has been called the Forgotten War. Calls for help have largely gone unheard by much of the world. Now, a silent killer is threatening to make matters worse for a country ill-equipped to handle a major health crisis. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
So we wanted to know if this cyber threat has been neutralized or if this is just the first in a series of attacks. So we've reached out to Joe Hancock in London. He's the cybersecurity chief at the law firm Mishcon Daraya. Thanks so much for joining us, Joe. Should we be afraid?
I don't think afraid is necessarily the right word. We should definitely be worried. I don't think we've seen the last of these attacks that have been ongoing for quite a while now. Cyber is one of these risks that kind of continues to grow on a daily basis. So we definitely should be worried, but perhaps not afraid.
Yeah, and when we look at, for example, where you are in the UK, the NHS was hit, big conglomerations, big institutions that affect the lives of millions of people. With that in mind, how fragile is global protection? How fragile are we all to these sorts of attacks?
I think everyone is very much at risk, from healthcare to energy to the defence sector. The problems we saw over the weekend really affected one of the most critical parts of the UK, and a part that's really held dear in people's minds. So it had a huge impact, both for the organisations themselves and also for individuals. I think we're likely to see more of these issues in healthcare as a sector broadly. We've seen them in the US before, we've seen them in the UK and Europe now, and I think we're likely to see them elsewhere. So this is a problem that's definitely going to keep growing.
Yeah, what were the particular vulnerabilities that can be changed and shored up so that it doesn't happen again?
This particular vulnerability seemed to come from some leaks that happened in March of material which alleged to have come from the NSA. These vulnerabilities were quite quickly picked up by criminals who then designed a piece of software to exploit them and to try and grab a ransom from the people who were affected. I think we're likely to see more of those problems where information gets disclosed and people need to move very quickly to respond. For me, it's all about speed of response and just doing the basics. If you do the basics, you'll be protected against most of the cyber threats that are out there at the moment. However, a lot of people don't do those today.
Well, thankfully, that guy, Marcus Hutchins, responded quickly. Is he a hero? What kind of conversation would we have been having right now had he not been smart enough to buy the domain and do what he did?
Yeah, I think Marcus has been a very big part of this, and he described himself as an accidental hero. I think he did something that was quite lucky there in stopping the spread of the virus. However, by Sunday, new versions of the virus had appeared that removed the particular feature around that domain. I think that we would have seen more problems on Friday and Saturday, but ultimately the level of problems we've seen now are probably about where we'd have got to. I think over the next few weeks we'll see this to be a continuous issue, though.
Okay, so these guys call themselves shadow brokers. Many people have called them cyber terrorists. They said more details in June, quite ominously. Maybe they're bluffing, we never know. Now there's a big question. Who done it, as they say? Now, there's a finger of blame pointing at North Korea. There was a finger of blame pointed at Vladimir Putin. He said, no, this came from the US. Who do you think was responsible for this?
The first thing to say is I'm not sure we'll ever know who's responsible for this. This particular attack really has the hallmarks of crime. I think this is probably like to be organised criminal gangs, which could be operating from anywhere around the world. In terms of the shadow broker side of things, I think that probably will come back to a particular nation state. I'm not sure which. But I think those two together are when we start to see the real problems.
Okay, so if I was a bad guy, I'm not saying I'm not, but if I was a bad guy with a lot of influence and a lot of money, and I wanted to hire some hackers to cause a lot of damage, would it be easy for me to hire the shadow brokers to do maximum damage?
I'm not sure it'd be easy for you to hire the shadow brokers. However, there are plenty of criminal groups at the moment that act as hackers for hire, or if not hackers for hire, provide kind of crime as a service. They'll provide you the software and tools needed to carry out these attacks. The barrier for being able to carry out such destructive attacks is unfortunately starting to come down every day. Hence why I think we'll see more and more of these in the future.
And where we stand right now in May 2017, in this arms race between hackers and those kind of cyber anarchists or cyber terrorists, whatever you want to call them, those who want to disrupt existing systems and those who are trying to shore up these systems, where does the momentum lie? Who's got the power? Who's got the momentum?
I think, unfortunately, the momentum is always going to be on the side of the attackers. They only have to be lucky once, or the defenders have to be lucky all of the time, every day. The arms race, unfortunately, is always going to be stacked in their favour.
Okay, and again, and I don't want to sort of ask you the same question again that I asked you at the very beginning. With that in mind, shouldn't we be freaking out here?
I wouldn't say being afraid or freaking out, because I'm not sure that's going to solve the problem. We definitely should be worried. We definitely need to do more. I think governments, businesses and individuals need to take cybersecurity more seriously than they have. And I think, as I said, if people are prepared just to do the basics, to put that support, finance, education in place to help all of us do the basics around cybersecurity better, we'll be in a much better place. If in a year's time that we don't learn any lessons from what's happened this weekend or this week, then I'll be at the point where I'm really afraid.
Might it be wise to maybe silo out some of this stuff and not maybe throw everything up onto the cloud as people have been doing over the past couple of years, because everything's integrated? Might it be wise to maybe just, break it up into chunks so that if one thing goes down, everything doesn't go down?
Yeah, I think breaking things up into chunks is always a good idea. It stops those kind of systemic problems, as we saw from the weekend, where an issue moves from organisation to organisation and from system to system. That's always a big problem. However, I don't think the cloud is necessarily the problem. I think the cloud provides so much benefit to businesses and to things like the NHS that it's something we should actually embrace and not be afraid of. However, we should try and separate these things out and really understand where those interconnections are, so we don't end up with a systemic problem as we have this weekend.
Joe, it's been good to talk to you. Joe Hancock, the cybersecurity lead at Mishcon de Reya. It's been an education. Enjoyed it. Next time, net neutrality. We look at how new laws and restrictions could change the way we experience the web. But that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.